The air in the John Deere dealership that spring of 1972 was thick with the smell of new paint, fresh rubber, and something else, the intoxicating aroma of easy credit. Farmers stood in small groups, their hands shoved in their overalls, talking in hushed, reverent tones about engine displacement and grain tank capacity. They were gathered around the centerpiece of the showroom floor, a machine that looked more like something from a science fiction magazine than the familiar landscape of rural Iowa. It was a brand new John Deere 6600 Combine, a behemoth of green and yellow steel that dwarfed every other piece of equipment in the building. Its cab was a glass-enclosed bubble, promising air conditioning and a radio, luxuries that were still the stuff of legend for most men who made their living from the dirt. At the center of the admiring crowd was Frank Miller, a man barely 30 years old, with a confident smile and the soft hands of someone who planned on letting horsepower do the heavy lifting. He was signing a thick stack of papers on the dealership manager's desk, the pen scratching with a finality that echoed through the cavernous showroom. He was buying the 6600, and everyone knew it. He was also buying the 200 acres of the old McGregor place that bordered his own, all of it financed by the Production Credit Association at a rate that seemed too good to be true. Jedediah Stone watched from the parts counter at the back of the dealership. He was a man from a different era, chiseled from the same stubborn granite as the field stones he picked from his soil every spring. His face was a roadmap of harvests past, etched with the lines of sun and worry. He wasn't there for a new machine. He was there for a single bearing, a specific Timken tapered roller bearing for the cylinder on his John Deere 95, a machine that had rolled off the assembly line back in 1961. "Can't find it in the book, Jed," the parts man, a young kid named Billy, mumbled, flipping through the greasy pages of a massive catalogue. "They don't list that part number anymore. Might be obsolete." Jed leaned over the counter, the smell of diesel and hydraulic fluid clinging to his worn flannel shirt. "It's not obsolete if the machine is still working. Look under the 55 series, same cylinder assembly, just a narrower body. Part number JD Everett 221. Billy's eyes widened as he found it. "Well, I'll be. How'd you know that?" "I've had that cylinder apart more times than you've had a hot meal, son," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. A man ought to know his equipment. Just then, Frank Miller, having signed the last of his papers, swaggered over, a triumphant grin plastered on his face. He clapped Jed on the shoulder, a gesture that was more condescending than friendly. "Jedediah, my man, still trying to keep that old museum piece glued together?" He boomed, loud enough for half the dealership to hear. A few sycophantic chuckles rose from the men trailing in his wake. "I just heard the bank approved me for the whole package. New 6600, the McGregor quarter section, the works. The banker said a man's got to expand to survive. Get big or get out," he said. Jed didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head and looked Frank square in the eye. His gaze was steady, clear, and carried the weight of a man who owned every nail in his barn and every acre he plowed. He looked at Frank's new boots, the clean crease in his jeans, and then at the loan papers clutched in his hand. "That banker, Frank," Jed said, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise. "Does he come out and help you when that new machine breaks down in the middle of the night? Does he help you turn a wrench, or does he just send you a bill every month?" Frank's smile tightened. "This thing won't break down, old man. It's brand new. Warranty from top to bottom. While you're out there breathing dust and tinkering with your relic, I'll be done with my beans in half the time, sitting in my air-conditioned cab listening to the ball game." Jed simply nodded and turned back to the counter as Billy returned with a small, heavy box. "There's a difference between a tool and a master, Frank," Jed said, not looking at him. "Your new combine owns a piece of you. That banker owns a piece of you. The only thing that owns me is the good Lord above, and the only thing I owe is a good night's sleep to my wife." He paid the $12.47 for the bearing in cash, coins and all, from a worn leather pouch. He tucked the box carefully into his coat pocket, gave a curt nod to the parts man, and walked out of the dealership. He didn't look back at the gleaming green monster, or the man who had just shackled himself to it with a chain of paper and ink. As the door hissed shut behind him, the silence he left was more powerful than all of Frank Miller's boasting. The old farmers who had seen booms and busts before looked at each other, a flicker of doubt in their eyes before turning their attention back to the new machine, its promise of an easier life too bright to ignore. Now, before we go any further into what happened over the next 10 years, a decade that would test every farmer in this country to their breaking point, I have to ask you folks, we've all known men like these two, the cautious, debt-free man who trusts his own hands, and the ambitious go-getter who's willing to bet the farm on the promise of tomorrow. Drop a comment below and let me know. Who would you rather have as a neighbor? The man running the old, paid-for, John Deere 95? Or the man with the brand new, bank-owned 60C600? Because the answer to that question says a lot about what kind of person you are, and what happened next in this story is going to prove one of them right, and the other one dead wrong. Jed drove his 1968 Ford F250 home, the V8 rumbling a familiar, comforting rhythm. The new bearing sat on the seat beside him, a small victory in a world that was rapidly changing. When he got back to his farmstead, the first thing he did was head to the machine shed. It wasn't a new pole barn like the one Frank Miller had just put up. It was an old-style barn with a gambrel roof, built by his own grandfather with hand-hewn timbers and pegged joints. The scent of old wood, dry hay, and grease hung in the air, a perfume of self-reliance. And there she sat, his combine. The John Deere 95. Her green paint was faded and chipped in places, showing the primer and even bare metal where the weather had been harshest. A few dings and welded repairs scarred her sheet metal, each one a story of a rock found the hard way, or a gatepost misjudged in the dark. To Frank Miller, she was a relic. To Jed Stone, she was an old and trusted friend. He didn't just jump into the repair. A job like this required a ritual. First, he blew the dust and chaff off the cylinder housing with compressed air, the hiss of the nozzle a prelude to the work ahead. Then he laid out his tools on a clean piece of canvas. Not a shiny new set from the auto parts store, but a collection of heavy, American-made wrenches and sockets from brands like SK and Wright, many of which had belonged to his father. They were dark with the patina of age and oil, worn smooth in the places where his hands and his father's hands had held them countless times. The cylinder housing was a tight space. Jed, a man built solid but not bulky, eased himself into the machine's guts. The work was slow and methodical. He used a heavy breaker bar to loosen the bolts, holding the bearing retainer, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching with the effort. Each bolt groaned in protest as it broke free from years of tension and rust. He knew the sound of stressed metal, the difference between a bolt that was loosening and one that was about to shear off. When one refused to budge, he didn't force it. He got out, fetched his torch, and gently heated the housing around the bolt, knowing the steel would expand just enough to release its grip. Once the retainer was off, he faced the old bearing. It was pressed onto the main cylinder shaft, a stubborn ring of hardened steel. This wasn't a job for a hammer and chisel. That was how you ruined a $50 bearing and a $500 shaft. He carefully attached a heavy-duty gear puller, its threaded screw and steel jaws looking like some medieval torture device. He tightened the screw, little by little, feeling the tension build. He could hear the old bearing begin to creak, a high-pitched metallic screech as it slowly, reluctantly, began to slide off the shaft. Finally, with a loud pop, it came free. He held the old bearing in his hand. He could feel the roughness in it, the slight catch and grind that told him it was on its last legs. He had caught it just in time. A failure during harvest would have cost him days, maybe even a week if the shaft got damaged. A week of rain in October could cost him a whole crop. He meticulously cleaned the shaft with emery cloth until it shone, then wiped it clean with a solvent-soaked rag. He gently heated the new bearing on a small electric hot plate, not too hot, just enough to make it expand by a few thousandths of an inch. With a pair of thick leather gloves, he picked up the hot bearing, aligned it perfectly, and slid it onto the shaft. It went on with a satisfying, final-sounding thud as it seated itself against the shoulder. No hammer needed. Just patience and an understanding of the physics of steel. This was Jed's way. He didn't see the machine as an adversary to be beaten into submission. He saw it as a partner. He spent the entire week before planting season and another 2 weeks before harvest going over every inch of his equipment. He changed the oil in the 95's Hercules engine, a big, slow-turning 6-cylinder that had a throaty growl instead of a high-pitched scream. He checked the tension of every belt and chain, adjusted the clearance on the straw walkers, and sharpened the blades on the sickle bar until you could shave with them. He greased every zerk fitting, pumping the handle of the grease gun until he saw fresh, clean grease pushing the old, dirty stuff out of the joint. By the time he was done, the John Deere 95 was as ready as a machine could be. That fall, the whispers started at the grain elevator. "Frank Miller knocked out 100 acres of beans today before the rain hit," one farmer would say. "That new 6600 just eats 'em up." "Yeah, I saw Jed Stone out in his field," another would add, shaking his head. "He was stopped. Looked like his header was plugged up with wet straw. That old thing just can't handle the tough going." Jed heard the talk. He knew they saw him as a stubborn old fool. And it was true, the harvest was a struggle. A wet October meant the bean stems were tough and stringy. The old 95, with its narrower cylinder and less aggressive design, would slug up if he pushed it too hard. He had to run in a lower gear, creeping along while Frank's 6600 flew across the neighboring fields, its powerful diesel engine barely seeming to notice the damp conditions. One afternoon, as a dark cloud bank built in the west, Jed was on his knees beside the combine, working to clear a particularly nasty slug of wet straw from the feeder house. He was covered in dirt, sweat, and chaff. A horn blared from the road. It was Frank, sitting high and clean in his new Ford pickup. He gave Jed a lazy wave, a pitying smirk on his face, before speeding off toward town, his day's work already done. Jed just gritted his teeth, pulled the last of the straw free, and climbed back onto the operator's platform. He fired up the Hercules engine, its deep bellow a defiant roar against the coming storm, and got back to work. He finished the last pass of the field just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, working by the dim glow of his headlights. His wife, Martha, had a hot meal waiting for him when he finally trudged into the house near midnight, weary to his bones. "John Carlson was telling me at the store that Frank Miller is already done with his harvest," she said, her voice laced with concern as she ladled beef stew into his bowl. "He's helping his father-in-law now." Jed sat down heavily at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands, the knuckles scraped raw, the fingernails permanently rimmed with black from grease and dirt. "Frank's got a big payment due on December 1st, Martha," he said, his voice tired but firm. "He has to be done. He has to sell that grain the minute it comes out of the field, no matter what the price is. We don't." He picked up his spoon. "We sleep at night. That's worth more than speed." Martha looked at him, her worry softening into the quiet strength he'd always relied on, and nodded. The next couple of years settled into that same pattern. Frank farmed more acres, faster than anyone. Jed farmed his own ground, slow and steady. But then, something started to happen in the wider world. News reports on the radio started talking about a massive grain sale to the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the demand for American corn and soybeans exploded. The price at the local elevator, which had hovered around $2 a bushel for beans for as long as anyone could remember, started climbing. It hit $3, then $4. By 1974, it was pushing $6 a bushel. Land prices, which had been stable for a generation, went crazy. Ground that had sold for $500 an acre was suddenly fetching $2,000, then $3,000. A wave of delirious optimism swept through the heartland. It felt like the good times were here to stay, and the only mistake a man could make was not thinking big enough. Frank Miller rode that wave like he was born to it. He was the golden boy of the farm credit system. With the soaring value of his land as collateral, the bank would lend him anything he wanted. He sold his 2-year-old 60C600 for nearly what he'd paid for it, and bought the newest, biggest machine John Deere had to offer, a 700 turbo. It had a 6-row corn head and a 20-foot grain platform. He bought a monstrous Steiger 4-wheel drive tractor for his fall tillage, a beast that could pull a chisel plow that made Jed's old John Deere 4020 and 5-bottom plow looked like a garden toy. He bought the 80 acres north of Jed's place when old man Hemmings retired. Frank was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, a massive operation for the time. He built a new ranch-style house for his wife, with a 2-car attached garage and central air. He put up a massive new Morton machine shed that could hold all his new equipment with room to spare. To the rest of the county, Frank Miller was the embodiment of success, the proof that the new way of farming was the only way. Jed watched it all from his side of the fence. He benefited from the high grain prices too. The year the beans hit $6, he had the best year of his life. His bins were full, and for the first time, he forward contracted a portion of his crop to lock in the incredible price. When the check from the elevator came, it was for more money than his father had seen in 10 years of farming combined. Martha sat with him at the kitchen table, the check lying between them. "We could do so much, Jed," she said, her voice filled with a hopeful tremor. "We could add on to the house. Get a new car. You could finally buy a new combine, one with a cab." Jed looked at the check, then out the window at his fields. He thought of the John Deere 95, sitting silent in the shed. He thought of Frank Miller's ever-expanding empire of debt. "We're going to do something better," he said. He took the check, and the next day he went to the bank. He didn't ask for a loan. He paid off the small operating note he took out each spring for seed and fertilizer. Then he took the rest of the money, a staggering amount, and bought savings certificates. The interest rate was a paltry 5%, but it was guaranteed. He bought a newer planter, a John Deere 7000 6-row, but it was 3 years old, and he paid cash for it from a farmer who was upgrading to a 12-row. His neighbors thought he'd gone crazy. "Jed, you're sitting on a gold mine," his friend Dave told him, over coffee at the diner. "The bank will lend you 4-to-1 on your land value. You could buy another half section, buy a new tractor, and the crop will pay for it in 2 years." Jed just shook his head. "And what happens if the price goes back down to $2, Dave? What happens when that note comes due?" "It's not going down. The whole world wants our grain. This is the new reality, Dave exclaimed, swept up in the fever. The talk turned from pitying Jed to scorning him. He was no longer just an old-fashioned farmer. He was a failure, a man who lacked the courage to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. Frank Miller, driving by in his brand-new Lincoln Town car, would just shake his head and laugh when he saw Jed out working on his old 40s-20. He started calling him Jedediah's Agricultural Museum, and the name stuck. One evening in the late summer of 1979, Jed was sitting on his porch, watching the heat lightning flash on the horizon. The corn was tall and healthy, promising another good crop. But the news on the radio was unsettling. A man named Paul Volcker had been appointed as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. The announcer said his sole mission was to break the back of inflation, which was raging at over 10%. To do that, the report said, he would have to raise interest rates to unprecedented levels. A chill ran down Jed's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. He thought about Frank Miller's massive operating loans, the mortgages on his land, the financing on his fleet of new equipment. Most of those loans, Jed knew, were on variable interest rates. They were tied to the prime rate. As he watched the silent, distant storm, he felt like he was seeing a preview of a different kind of storm, one that was gathering over the entire farm belt, a storm that would wash away the proud and the overextended and spare only the humble and the prepared. He didn't know when it would hit, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was coming. The year 1980 dawned cold and uncertain. In January, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The news crackled over the AM radio in Jed's machine shed, a distant political decision that hit the Corn Belt like a physical blow. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn prices, which had been the foundation of a decade of borrowing, plunged. For Jed, it was a painful but survivable hit. His bins were still half full of last year's crop, and since he owed no man a dime, he could afford to sit on it and wait. For Frank Miller, it was the first tremor in the financial earthquake that was about to level his world. His entire business model was predicated on high volume and fast turnover. He had to sell his grain, regardless of the price, to meet the massive operating loan payment that was due in March. The pressure began to show. The easy confidence that had been Frank's trademark began to curdle into a brittle anxiety. He pushed his equipment harder than ever, trying to make up for low prices with more acres, renting another 160 from a widow who lived in town. His new Steiger tractor, a monstrous green machine with dual wheels on all four corners, ran day and night that spring, its halogen lights cutting through the darkness as he tried to get his crop in faster than anyone else. The first real crack appeared that summer. A brutal drought settled over the Midwest in July, the sky turning a hazy, metallic grey. The corn, which had looked so promising in June, began to suffer. The leaves curled up during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, turning a sickly, pale green. By August, it was clear the yields were going to be a disaster. For Jed, it was just another turn of the wheel, another test from the Almighty. He watched his own corn struggle and knew it would be a lean year. He spent his time in the shop, methodically going over the John Deere 95, replacing a worn-out feeder chain, patching a small rust hole in the grain tank. The work was a comfort, a familiar ritual in an uncertain time. For Frank, the drought was a catastrophe. He had fertilized for 200 bushel corn, an expense he'd already paid for with borrowed money. Now he'd be lucky to harvest 100 bushels per acre. The math was turning against him with a terrifying speed. The breaking point came during the soybean harvest that October. The beans were short and brittle from the lack of rain, the pods prone to shattering on the ground before they even got into the combine. It was a harvest that required a delicate touch, a slow and steady hand. Frank had no time for slow. He was running his massive John Deere 7700 turbo as fast as it would go, the 20-foot header rattling across the dry ground, trying to beat the next bank notice. One afternoon, Jed was out in his own field, the old 95, chugging along at a sensible pace, its smaller 13-foot header easier to control. He saw Frank's machine stop abruptly in the middle of the neighboring field. A plume of blue-white smoke, the unmistakable smell of burning hydraulic fluid, drifted across the fence line. Jed shut down his own machine and watched. Frank jumped from the cab, a silhouette of pure panic, and frantically began pulling at the side shields. Jed climbed down and walked over. By the time he got there, Frank was staring at a puddle of shimmering red oil spreading in the dirt under the belly of his combine. A high-pressure hose, one of dozens that snaked through the machine's complex innards to power the hydrostatic transmission and the header controls, had ruptured. "She just quit," Frank said, his voice hollow. The header dropped, steering went out, everything. Just quit. Jed knelt, the knees of his overalls dark with the rich soil. He peered into the tangled maze of hoses, wires, and solenoids. "Looks like your main pressure line for the hydrostat let go." "Can you fix it?" Frank asked, the question sounding like a prayer. Jed looked at the specialized crimped fitting on the end of the hose. "Not out here, Frank. That's not a standard fitting you can just clamp on. The dealer has a special hydraulic press to make these up. You'll have to call them." Frank's shoulders slumped. He looked defeated. "I called them. They said the service truck is tied up on another job 2 counties over. It'll be tomorrow morning at the earliest before they can get here, and they're not sure if they have that specific hose in stock. Might have to order it." A day, in the middle of a frantic harvest, with the weather forecast threatening wind, a single lost day was an eternity. For a man living on the knife's edge of financial ruin, it was a death sentence. Jed looked at the massive, silent machine, a monument to progress that was now as useless as a boulder. He then looked back at his own combine, the simple, mechanical 95, patiently waiting. He could rebuild its entire hydraulic system with parts from the local hardware store and a set of wrenches. "I'll finish this field for you, Frank," Jed said quietly. Frank looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and shame. "You?" "My header's smaller. It'll take me a while. But the beans will be in the bin instead of on the ground. You go to town and wait for the parts, man." Frank couldn't speak. He just nodded, a man humbled by a simple piece of reinforced rubber tubing. As Jed walked back to his own machine, he didn't feel triumph. He felt a profound sadness. He saw Frank not as a rival, but as a man who had been sold a dream of effortless power, never realizing that the more complicated the machine, the more fragile the thread of control. That evening, under the harvest moon, the steady, rhythmic growl of the 95's Hercules engine was the only sound for miles around, a lonely testament to a way of farming that was being forgotten, but was not yet gone. The winter that followed was a season of grim silence across the farm belt. The news from the Federal Reserve was relentless. Paul Volcker, true to his word, kept raising the interest rates. The prime rate, the number upon which all their variable rate loans were based, climbed from 15% to 18%, then to a staggering 20%. The letters from the Production Credit Association and the local banks, once friendly reminders, became stark, threatening demands. For families like Frank Miller's, the monthly statements were like reports from a battlefield where they were losing badly. The interest on his loans was compounding at a rate that was impossible to comprehend. His payments ballooned, doubling and then tripling, while his income had been slashed by the embargo and the drought. He was trapped in an inverted nightmare, where his assets, the land and equipment he had been so proud of, were now anchors pulling him under. The land that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre just a few years prior was now struggling to find a buyer at half that. The banks, seeing their collateral evaporate, began to panic. The first farm auction notice appeared in the county paper in the spring of 1982. It was for the Carlson family, good people who had farmed their ground for 3 generations. The photograph in the ad showed a lineup of nearly new, bright red International Harvester equipment. The whole community went to the sale, not to buy, but to watch, a morbid curiosity drawing them to witness the public dismantling of a neighbor's life. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant felt like a funeral dirge. Men stood in silent clusters, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They were watching their own fears played out on the Carlsons' front lawn. After that, it became a flood. Every week, another notice, another family's name. The Miller auction was scheduled for a cold, windy Saturday in April of 1983. The notice was a full page, a testament to the scale of Frank's ambition and the totality of his failure. The list of equipment was staggering. The Steiger Panther 4-wheel drive, the John Deere 7700 turbo combine, a fleet of tractors, plows, planters, wagons. And at the end of the list, in stark black letters, 320 acres of prime farmland to be sold in 2 parcels. It included the original 80 acres that had been in his family since his grandfather had homesteaded it. Jed went to the auction. Martha didn't want him to. "It feels like picking over a grave," she said. "I'm not going to pick," Jed replied, his voice heavy. "I'm going to bear witness." The scene was surreal. The gleaming green machines, which had once been symbols of Frank's untouchable success, were lined up in the muddy field, price tags hanging from their steering wheels. They looked forlorn, like captured kings. Frank was there, standing beside his wife near the farmhouse. He looked 10 years older than he had the year before. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollowed out. He avoided looking at anyone, staring at a fixed point on the horizon. Jed watched as the auctioneer started with the smaller items, the tools and shop equipment. Then came the big machines. A hush fell over the crowd as the bidding began on the 7700 turbo combine. This was Frank's pride and joy, the machine that was supposed to make him invincible. It sold for less than 1/3 of what Frank still owed on it. The Steiger tractor went next, for an equally devastating loss. Jed could feel the collective gasp of the crowd, the shared pain of men who understood exactly what those numbers meant. While the machinery was being sold, Jed slipped away from the main crowd and found the banker who was overseeing the land sale. He was a man in a suit who looked uncomfortable in the muddy field. Jed knew him from his few dealings at the bank. "I'm here to bid on Parcel A," Jed said quietly. "The home 80. The banker looked at him, surprised. "Jedediah, I didn't figure you for an expansionist." "I'm not," Jed said. "That's Miller land. It ought to stay Miller land if it can." The bidding for the land was tense. A few outside investors, speculators smelling blood in the water, were bidding aggressively. But Jed held his ground. He had a number in his head, a fair price based on what the land could actually produce, not on the inflated values of the bubble. It was the money he had saved, the money from the good years that he hadn't squandered. When the auctioneer's gavel finally fell, the home 80 acres, the heart of the Miller farm, belonged to Jedediah Stone. He didn't feel a sense of victory, only a heavy weight of responsibility. He saw Frank watching him from across the yard, his face a mask of disbelief and what looked like betrayal. Jed simply met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that Frank couldn't possibly understand yet. While his neighbors were being sold out, Jed survived. The crisis years were lean, but his foundation was solid rock, not sand. His cost of production was a fraction of what the big operators had. He burned his own wood for heat. Martha kept a huge garden, canning enough vegetables to last through the winter. His biggest expenses were fuel and seed, which he paid for with cash from his savings. When a part broke on his old 4020 tractor, he didn't call a dealer. He drove to a salvage yard, a place that had become a lifeline for farmers like him, and pulled the part he needed off a wrecked machine for a few dollars. His farm was an ecosystem of thrift and self-reliance. The John Deere 95 was the heart of it. Every autumn, it rumbled to life, a faded green symbol of endurance. It wasn't fast, it wasn't comfortable, but it was his. And in a time when the banks owned everything, owning your own combine, free and clear, was the truest measure of a man's wealth. A week after the auction, after the last of the equipment had been hauled away and an eerie silence had fallen over the Miller farmstead, Frank's pickup truck pulled into Jed's lane. Frank got out slowly, like an old man. He walked up to the porch where Jed was sitting, cleaning a carburetor in a pan of gasoline. He stood there for a long moment, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "I heard you bought the home place," he said, his voice raspy. Jed nodded, setting the carburetor parts down on a clean rag. "I did." "Come to gloat?" Frank's voice was laced with bitterness. "Come to tell me you told me so?" "No," Jed said, looking him straight in the eye. "I came to make you a proposal. I'm not a landlord, Frank. I don't want to be. I want a tenant." Frank stared at him, confused. "I'll rent you the 80, Jed continued. "Crop share. 1/3 for me, 2/3 for you. You live in the house, you work the ground. It's your home. You just pay me with a share of what you raise. There's no cash involved unless you want it to be." Frank was speechless. He sank down onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. "Why?" he finally whispered. "After everything, all the things I said, calling you a museum keeper." "Because this isn't about me being right," Jed said, his voice softening. "It's about a neighbor needing a hand. It's about that land, having your name on it for 100 years. That means something. Pride is a luxury, Frank. Survival is a necessity. You're a good farmer, one of the best I've ever seen. You just got caught in a storm you couldn't control. Nobody could." That was the beginning. Frank Miller, the man who had once farmed 1,000 acres with the biggest equipment money could buy, started over. He farmed his original 80 acres with Jed's second tractor, an old John Deere 3020, and a 4-row planter Jed helped him rebuild. It was humbling, back-breaking work, a return to a scale of farming he hadn't known since he was a boy. But for the first time in years, he slept through the night. He was no longer a slave to a payment book. The community, which had been so quick to praise Frank's ambition and then scorn Jed's caution, saw what had happened. They saw Jed, not as a stubborn old fool, but as a man of quiet wisdom. They saw his act of grace toward Frank not as a business transaction, but as a lesson in what it truly meant to be a neighbor. The term Jedediah's Agricultural Museum was never spoken again. Instead, farmers started showing up at Jed's shop. "Jed, my combine's down, and the dealer says it's a week to get the part." "Jed, you know anything about the governor on an old 40 series tractor?" He never turned anyone away. He'd wipe the grease from his hands, listen patiently, and more often than not, find a way to get their machine running again with a bit of ingenuity, and some parts from his well-stocked cache of salvaged odds and ends. His farm became an unofficial hub of survival, a place where the old ways were rediscovered and passed on out of sheer necessity. Years passed. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip, prices stabilized, and the rain returned. Frank, through sheer hard work and Jed's stable backing, began to prosper again on his small scale. He eventually saved enough to buy the 80 acres back from Jed, paying him the exact amount Jed had paid at the auction, with no interest. The day they signed the papers at the kitchen table was a quiet one, sealed with a handshake between two men who had been forged into friends by the fire of adversity. Jed grew older. His hands became more gnarled with arthritis, his steps slower. His son, Thomas, who had seen the wisdom in his father's ways, eventually took over the day-to-day work of the farm. But Jed was never far from the machine shed. One bright autumn afternoon, when Jed was well into his 70s, he stood with his grandson, a boy of 12 named Samuel. They were in the old barn, in front of the John Deere 95. It was retired from active duty now, replaced by a slightly newer but still modest and paid-for 620 model. But Jed kept the 95 pristine. He started it up every few months, the old Hercules engine still barking to life with a familiar, throaty roar. "Grandpa," Samuel asked, running his hand over the faded green paint, "why do you keep this old thing? Dad's combine is so much bigger." Jed smiled, a deep and knowing smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He placed his heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Samuel," he began, his voice a low rumble like the old engine itself. "This machine taught me the most important lesson a man can learn. There are two kinds of farmers in this world. There are those who work to buy more iron, and there are those who make their iron work for them. This combine, it never owned a piece of me. We were partners." He pointed to a small brass plaque he had bolted to the side of the operator's platform years ago. Samuel leaned in to read the words Jed had stamped into it himself. "The bank is not your partner. Some people will tell you that you have to get big or get out," Jed continued, his gaze drifting out the open barn door toward the fields, golden in the late afternoon sun. "But the truth is, you just have to last. You have to endure the storms. And you can't do that when you're carrying a debt that's heavier than any harvest you could ever bring in." He looked down at his grandson, seeing the future of his family and his farm in the boy's curious eyes. "Remember that, Samuel. True wealth isn't about the size of your machine shed or the number of acres on a map. It's the peace you feel when you turn the key in a machine you own outright. It's the freedom of knowing that when the harvest is done, it's all yours. It's the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived on your own terms." The boy nodded, not fully understanding the depth of the words, but sensing their importance. He looked from his grandfather's weathered face to the old combine, a silent, steel testament to a hard-won truth. And in the quiet of the barn, surrounded by the scent of old grease and good earth, the legacy was passed on, not on a deed or in a will, but in the simple, enduring story of the man who kept the old machine, and in doing so, saved everything that truly mattered.